So, in summary, there's an enormous amount of willful edits and insertions into the New Testament, which makes it highly probable that any given passage could be a later insertion. Verses 15 and 16 intrude upon the surrounding context in its hateful tone. Paul never exhibits such a hateful tone toward his fellow Jews in any of his other letters or any other part of 1 Thessalonians. Paul tells us in Romans that he believes the Jews will eventually all be saved, but here he is claiming that God has abandoned them for good in a fit of wrath. Verse 16 contains a reference to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, but most scholars date Paul's letters to the mid-50s, a good 15 years before the fall of Jerusalem. If we take Acts for history, which I don't, but for the sake of argument I will here, then Paul would have already been dead before the fall of Jerusalem, and since verse 16 refers to that event, Paul could never have written it. In this passage, Paul claims that the Jews killed Jesus, but in 1 Corinthians, he claims that the rulers of this age killed Jesus. We've already seen that this refers to the demons, as Marcion and Origen corroborate in their own writings. If the passage is genuine and Paul really did believe that the Jews killed Jesus and the prophets, how do we explain the shocking silence about that in Romans 11, where Paul is discussing the Jews' rejection of his gospel message and also citing the Old Testament claim that the Jews killed the prophets? In a passage so similar to the one in question, there is not a whisper about the Jews killing Jesus. The only solution that answers all of these issues is that Paul did not write the passage in question, and it was written by an Orthodox Gentile Christian, most likely in the early part of the 2nd century. And I'd say the insertion could have happened no earlier than about 20 years after Paul's original was written, due to the reference to the fall of Jerusalem in verse 16, and probably no later than about 70 years after Paul's original was written, due to the prominence he began to have around the time of Marcion, roughly 130 CE, who collected the Pauline epistles, or rather what he considered to be the Pauline epistles, all but the pastorals, into his own canon of Scripture, the first canon or collection of the New Testament writings that we know of, which even predates Origen's canon by almost 100 years. The insertion has to be late enough to be not only after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, but late enough for the Orthodox gospel story to have circulated to the person who inserted it, and that would most likely take another few decades, since Christian orthodoxy did not get into full swing until the 2nd century. Another objection to the Jesus myth theory has just been answered. Well, I think we've made a pretty good case to show that 1 Thessalonians 2, 15 and 16 were inserted much later, and they weren't written by Paul. So I hope that is convincing for you. I hope that it helps to see that a problem in the Jesus myth theory is not always necessarily a problem. It may look that way at face value, but if we dig a little deeper, we may start uncovering some things that we didn't know were there. So that does it for this time. We'll look at another exception in a future video and see if we can pick it apart and make some sense of it too. So if you see any exceptions you'd like me to cover, I've made a list in the first video. So if you go through that list and you see something that's not there, send me a message or whatever, and then we can keep adding to that list. If it's a if you think it's a real problem, so we can keep updating that. All right, it's been fun, and I'll catch y'all on the flip side.